Thank you so much for having us here. Thank you, Boaz and Chaim, for organizing this workshop. This talk today is an extension of an article that I published about 18 months ago, where I focused more on wartime memoirists. Now I want to go further to the post-war period. Socialist organizer Shneur Yaffe immigrated to America in 1906 at the age of 20 from his native Lita, Lithuania. Remembered that he lived in a village and then he had to walk a very long way to the cheder, to the traditional school, each day. On his way back, the peasant's dog repeatedly attacked him. But the Shkotzim, the Gentile lads, were even worse than the dogs, and they kept beating him up to a point where, quote, my young life was constantly in danger. Published a couple of years after Yaffe, the town of Vitebsk Yizker, or commemorative book, featured an article by Alexander Rappaport, who used to live there, also a historian, and he argued, quote, Jews were socially separated from the non-Jewish population by an immovable wall. In terms of livelihood, Christians had to buy from Jews and the Jews had to buy farm produce from the peasants. But apart from the business ties, both the Jew and the non-Jew were distant from one another, unquote. Yaffe published his book in 1953, his memoir in 1953, and Vitebsk Yizker book came out in 1956. Please keep in mind this time frame. I'm going to get back to that. Various commentators have examined American Jewish popular culture, theater, film, literature, ethnography, arguing that static, ahistorical imagery of Jewish life in pre-Holocaust Eastern Europe, mostly exemplified by the shtetl, emerged in the post-war year. Just to give you a couple of examples, the critics attacked what they saw as American Jews' attempt to create a saccharine, nostalgic, soppy version of the Jewish past in East Europe. Commentator Midge Decter lambasted The World of Sholem Aleichem. The World of Sholem Aleichem was a 1953 musical in Broadway, kind of Broadway show, collection of short plays by Sholem Aleichem and Peretz. And she argued that it fabricated, quote, just the kind of Never Never Land American Jews like to think they came from, unquote. Writing about 10 years later, the critic Irving Howe accused Fiddler on the Roof, Kanar al Agag, those of you who know that, he said they were creating, quote, the cutest shtetl we never had, unquote. Now, my paper, what I'm going to do today is to show that even before those productions and during those years, Yiddish memoirists had put forward a version of the Jewish past which underlined violence, underlined conflict through their own personal histories, and by doing that they reimagined the past according to their lessons from the Holocaust. Looking back at their personal histories, and I want to emphasize, all of them arrived in America decades before the Holocaust. We're not talking about people who ever experienced the Holocaust. They sought to show that the Holocaust was not an exception, but rather a perpetuation and culmination of deep-seated anti-Jewish enmity. Now, this large group of people that I'm going to mention only a few, I don't have time, sorry, Zionists, Socialists, Orthodox, non-partisan, a mixture, came to America prior to the Holocaust, many of them even prior to World War I, and all of them, all of the people I'm going to talk about, published their recollections in the 20 years after 1945. In their portrayal of their own lives and Jewish life in general, in Eastern Europe, those memoirists often oversimplified a very complex and nuanced details of Jewish existence in order to fit it into a more generalized and rather, I would say, one-dimensional picture of Jewish life. And that tendency is especially noticeable when depicting Jewish-Gentile relations in Eastern Europe. Market scenes which pitted Jews against Christian peasants were indeed a staple of many memoirs. Just to mention a couple, Avrum Pinchas Unger, who was a garment worker, organizer for a garment union, born in 1880 in the town of Strykov in Poland, near Lodz, or Łódź, before immigrating to America in 1910. His memoir, Mein Heimshtetl Strykov, was published by the Arbeiter Ring, by the Workmen's Circle, in America in 1957. Unger recalled how during local fairs, peasants would sometimes get drunk and thinking a Jew cheated them, began shouting, beat up the Jews, and fights would break out. Unger remembered, however, that both the Russian police constable and the judge justified the Jews and warned the peasants. A similar experience can be found in a memoir of a member of the Socialist Bund, Meir Kushner, who was born in 1881 in Kremenchug, not in a shtetl, but in an industrial city in Ukraine, Kremenchug, and he emigrated to the States, to New York in 1906. And he was also active in the garment industry, and the Jewish labor movement. Published his autobiography in 1960, and he recounted that when the peasants came every Sunday to the city churches, they would hear their the priest, and the Jews were frightened since the peasants were, quote, were easily agitated to a pogrom. A similar experience was told by the leader of labor Zionists in America, Borech Zuckerman. He was born in a small town by the name of Kurenitz, near Vilna, in Lithuania, in 1887, came to America as a teenage boy in 1904, and even though he was living in Israel by the early 60s, he published in New York, in Yiddish, the first volume of his memoirs, where he described how drunken peasants would tear a prayer book from his father's hands, made fun of it, and assaulted his father. At another time, two big Polish youths struck his father because the father didn't take off his hat when he was walking, just near a local church in Vilna. And if I can go back to Shner Yaffe, with whom I opened, in the summertime, Yaffe's father used to lease orchards and sell their fruits, something that many Jews did that was kind of an economic niche. And once he had a dispute over a certain transaction with a few Russian buyers, Yaffe commented, "With some Goyim, you can still come to an understanding, but with Russians, it's bad," before describing how the enraged Russian clients were looking to settle the score with his dad. So you have many recollections along those lines, many memoirs and Yizkor books as well. Those of you who read Hebrew, Hannah Grinkreut, Greenboim, Ayarati Kalvaria is one perfect example of that. Pogroms, harassment, violence, Gentile drunkenness, volatility, crudeness, vulgarity often characterized most of the spectrum of Jewish, non-Jewish relations in those memoirs and autobiographies. It's important to emphasize that, and again, I'd like to underline that, of course you had cases of violence between Jews and non-Jews. You had hatred between those two communities. You cannot fit the spectrum of Jewish-Gentile relations into that worldview. It was much more nuanced. And of course, those accounts reflect true events, true attitudes, and they constitute, I believe, a very valid historical source for the study of Eastern European Jewish society. At the same time, historically, those accounts hardly comprise the whole gamut of relations between Jews and Christians in Eastern Europe, and as I mentioned, those relations were much more dynamic than what those memoirists were accounting for. And quite often they were characterized by peaceful coexistence. And that's a topic, and again, I don't want to go too much into that. Many scholars covered that. David Beal, Emmanuel Etkes, Rachel Mencken, Benjamin Nathan, Anthony Polonsky, to mention just a few. Furthermore, as external, and just to give you an example how Jewish-Christian relationships were intertwined, as external influences permeated most facets of Jewish life, Jews increasingly adopted components of their neighbors' cuisine. Those of you who know how Hasidim are dressed up until this very day, they're dressed like the Polish Shlachta, the Polish nobility. Cuisine, garb, language. In remote areas where the whole Jewish population was 2 or 3 families, closer personal relations formed in spite of religious and social inhibitions. And some shtetl or even city Jews employed non-Jewish maids and servants who lived with the family. They lived within the Jewish domestic sphere. They learned how to speak Yiddish. The maids would say the brachot, the blessings, together with the kids in Yiddish and Hebrew. And they became very attached to the family. They learned to speak fluent Yiddish. They used to call other Gentiles Goyim and all that. So we're talking about a much more dynamic and I believe nuanced reality. Now, how can we determine that it was the Holocaust per se that caused post-war memoirists to convey a more one-dimensional picture of their younger years? And here I would say there are 2 ways to do that. Some of the memoirists mention the Holocaust directly. With other ones, it's kind of indirect. And those memoirs, what they put across is what Barbara Kirschenblatt-Gimblett, she called it the mode of a memory work signaled by the term a vanished world, because that's usually what they do. I don't have time to talk about that. There is a very interesting wartime memoir by Yud Zinger, the brother of Bashevi Zinger, called Von der Welt, wo es ist nicht mehr, from a world which is no more, and which is exactly in that, one of the earliest examples of that. And in those memoirs, the Jewish past was kind of flattened into a one-dimensional picture in order to fit into the world as it seemed after the Holocaust. To give you an example, Borach Zuckerman, when he was writing his memoir, again, after the Holocaust, he described how socialist Zionists were important in America. They started the American Jewish Congress movement, and so on. And then he lamented that the Nazis defiled the name National Socialism because he wanted to describe labor Zionists as National Socialists, but he said, now we cannot use this language. Those SOBs took it from us. And Meyer Kushner, he detailed a Jewish-Italian friction within the New York garment industry in the early 20th century, in 1911, 1912, because the Italian workers wanted a separate local that will not be a Yiddish-speaking local, but that they can speak Italian there. And Kushner referred to the Italian leader, Juan Laparta, as someone that today would call a regular fascist. Now, fascist because he wanted a different Italian local. And in those examples, the memoirist would use post-war terminology, Nazism, fascism, when referring to earlier events. A much more direct presence of the Holocaust can be found in the memoir of the leading critic of the Yiddish theater, A. Mukdoini, the pseudonym of Alexander Kapell, Alexander the Great, Alexander Mukdoini, and he immigrated to America in 1920, published 2 volumes of his memoirs in 1955, again, within that time frame. And he looked back at his experience in Warsaw before World War I. So he's looking at events 50 years earlier, and he noted, quote, okay, that might be offensive, but I kind of enjoy those quotes. Quote, the Pole is the most unusual Slav. He has all the shortcomings of the Slavs, but not even one of their virtues. Mukdoini argued that the Pole can cry like a child, at the same time torment people like a dreadful sadist. The Pole must hate since that is his second nature. Mukdoini described how, quote, a Pole, whether a man or a woman, will not go out on the street without gloves, but under their fingernails there is a dark line of filth. Perhaps Mukdoini deemed that graphic portrayal to be necessary as a preface to his attack against the Polish culture and Polish intelligentsia. If you scratch a Polish revolutionary or radical, an anti-Semite or reactionary jumps out. The critic, Mukdoini, mentioned World War I when Poles, quote, collaborated with their biggest enemy, Tsarist Russia, in order to torment their weak, defenseless neighbor, the Jew. And for the time of Hitler's, and then he moves immediately, even though he's talking about 1909, 1910, into World War II. At the time of Hitler's occupation, we have scores of books by Jewish survivors about the close partnership of Poles with Hitler's murderers. Moreover, the Germans, quote, tormented them, the Poles, almost as much as they did to the Jews. But the Poles helped Hitler's murderers to exterminate Jews. All of that in a part of a memoir that speaks about pre-World War I. Mukdoini concluded, yes, after Hitler, the Pole would remain our historical Amalek, the biblical sworn enemy of the Israelites, which partnered with the murderers of Jews. Now, I believe one of the most notable and early examples of how the Jewish past was kind of flattened or described in a one-dimensional way was something that Avraham mentioned today by Abraham Joshua Heschel, one of the most important theologians, philosophers, Jewish philosophers of the 20th century. In 1945, which is only 5 years after he arrived in America, Heschel he delivered a lecture in Yiddish at the YIVO, the Institute for Jewish Research in New York, and that lecture would later be expanded to a book called The Earth is the Lord's, The Inner World of the Jew in Eastern Europe. That's the English version that I believe Avraham was referring to. The original, the Yiddish, the lecture was published in Yiddish already in 1945 in YIVO Blätter, and a year later in 1946 there was a booklet titled the Mizrach Europäische Yid, the Eastern European Jew. The English translation does not fit totally the Yiddish origin. Just to give you an example, in that essay, Heschel delineated the different eras of the Jewish history, the Sephardi era, the Ashkenazi era, and so on. And then, in the Ashkenazi, and this is a quote, in the Ashkenazi era, the spiritual life of Jews happened in seclusion. The people lived on its own among primitive Germanic and Slavic masses. Spiritually and mentally, Jews stand higher than their neighbors, unquote. Didn't appear like that in English. No, not exactly. And Heschel stressed that at least what he saw is Jewish seclusion, and he argued that Jews, quote, borrowed no forms and no ideas from other cultures, unquote. Period. Exclamation point. Again, Heschel underscored, and again, it's not as if he is totally wrong. There are elements of that among Ashkenazi Jewry, but, and he, again, underscored very important aspects, and there is definitely a Jewish self-image vis-a-vis the non-Jewish surroundings, but it's also a very rigid portrayal that brushed aside many aspects of interactions between Jews and their neighbors. Now, the memoirist rather simplified portrayal of Jewish-Gentile relations stands in a dark contrast, a really kind of deep contrast, to the paradigm that many scholars presented. Let me give you two examples by notable scholars, Dan Meron and Israel Bartal. Meron has analyzed the image of the shtetl in the writings of classical Yiddish writers in the 19th century. Sholem Aleichem, Sholem Yankev Abramovich, he's known as Mendele Mocher Sforim. It's not his pen name, it's one of his literary creations, among other writers. And he wrote, it was an influential tradition, a potent form, and he said that all of those writers would Judaize the shtetl, meaning that when they wrote their stories or novels, they would either chuck out all the goyim, or what they will present, according to him, if at all, Gentile presence in the shtetl would be by let's say, half Judaized characters. The Shabbos Goy, a Russian gendarme who happens to be a Meshumed, a converted Jew. And in all of those towns, Sholem Aleichem's Kasrilevka, Mendele's Kapzansks and Glupsk and all that, are ahistorical Hermetic Jewish universes. More recently, the historian Israel Bartal also discussed Maskilic and classic Yiddish literature with its old Jewish shtetl, arguing that those writers' ethno-geographic segregation had a kernel of truth, but that didn't mean that the center of town, where the market space was only Jewish. And Barbara Kirschenblatt-Gimblet noted in her discussion of Life is with People, a 1952 book by Mark Zborowski and Elizabeth Herzog, that those post-war anthropologists drew on that literary tradition to say, yeah, they rendered the shtetl totally Judaized, frozen in time. Something that led them to conflate the shtetl, the town, with the kehila, with the congregation, and they sometimes use that interchangeably, even though it's not true. Post-Holocaust memoirists, not only that they did not hide the presence of Gentiles, they put it on a pedestal, but a negative pedestal. They stressed it while often highlighting, again, the conflict, the violence, animosity, in order to fit it into their version. And what happens is that the destruction of European Jewry prompted those writers to look for the seeds of evil as they saw it. Why did European civilization crumble? And in that light, or in that darkness, they changed their own histories and put different emphasis in those recollections. And they wanted to demonstrate that the Holocaust was a direct continuation of European life and culture rather than an aberration. And as American-born Jews flattened the image of the old country to a saccharine version of shtetl life, again, Fiddler on the Roof is a great example, but you have others, Yiddish-speaking immigrants in those very years and even a little bit beforehand, who actually lived in Eastern Europe, also flattened that image, but to the other direction, to the opposite direction. In light of the Holocaust, they redrew their own past into a dark tale of Jewish insularity in a uniformly hostile Gentile world. Was it only the Holocaust that created that break in time? No. When you look at memoirs from the 1920s and the 1930s, Jewish memoirists from East Europe and also the States were reviewing and reimagining their own life in light of earlier events. What would be those events wave of pogroms in Eastern Europe between 1917 and 1922, which many historians see as a prelude, as a kind of a preparation for the Holocaust, in which 150 to 200,000 Jews were murdered in what was a huge war zone in Ukraine. And you can see that in many of the memoirists who wrote in the 20s and the 1930s in their depictions of Poles, Ukrainians, and Russians. Not in that order. Ukrainian, Poles, and Russians. And all of what I said right now does not mean that those memoirs and autobiographies are not valid historical sources. They are. Sometimes I ask my students, I give them an assignment, do you think memoirs are a primary source or a secondary source? Discuss. And then, you know, they come with all sorts of stuff. And those memoirs and autobiographies are definitely valid historical sources, but I believe that what I just presented point to their challenging character that we must keep in mind when working with those texts. Thank you very much.